work. Dustin Beall Smith's work has appeared in Alaska Quarterly Review, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Backstage, the Gettysburg Review, Hotel America, the Louisville Review, the New York Times Magazine, Quarto, Riverteeth, The Sun, Writing on the Edge, and more. That's a lot. His honors include the Catherine Bakeless Nason Prize in Nonfiction for Key Grip, a memoir of endless consequences, fellowships in 1995 and 1996 at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and first place Labor Press Council Awards for 1982, 83, and 84. Again, that's a lot. In the late 50s and early 60s, Smith helped pioneer sport parachuting in the United States. He later worked as an advance man for Robert Kennedy's senatorial campaign and for the Norman Mailer Jimmy Breslin mayoral campaign. He worked as a key grip in the film industry for 27 years, leaving movie making to pursue an MFA in creative writing at Columbia University. He currently teaches at Gettysburg College, where he is also the coordinator of the Peer Learning Center. Without further ado, I bring you Dustin Beall Smith.
Thank you, Andrea. I'm going to read a chapter called One Day. I might read a really short chapter after this as well. And but this is called One Day. The epigraph for this comes from Elizabeth Bishop's poem, The Prodigal. But it took him a long time finally to make his mind up to go home, which gives you some idea of what this is about. A bit of an idea. I don't think it needs any introduction except to say that it takes place in the mid-70s, and Flannery O'Connor plays a part in it. So, one day, when I woke up, I found myself standing naked on the second-floor balcony of the motel. I gripped the metal railing like a deranged Caesar and prepared to address the populace. Looking out over the dimly lit parking lot, I realized there was not a soul in sight. I checked my wristwatch, then assessed the situation. For some reason, being naked at 4 a.m. seemed less significant than what I needed to say to the people, but I couldn't quite recall the precise message. Within this mental vacuum, the nature of my predicament began to take shape. I looked over my shoulder and saw that the door to my room was closed. Reflexively, I patted my bare thighs, feeling for a room key. I tested the door, twisting the knob with both hands, to no effect. It was locked. It wouldn't do to kick the door in, not with bare feet, not with the star of the movie asleep in the room next to mine. No way I could just walk into the motel office and ask for a key. I would be fired for sure. I walked along the balcony, weighing my options. I began to imagine the news spreading on the movie set that morning, how the key grip from New York had been arrested at dawn by the Georgia State Police, charged with wandering about naked in the middle of the night, how blood tests had revealed an alcohol level like none ever recorded before, how further tests had found evidence of a nearly lethal mixture of drugs. Deciding to seek help from a fellow crew member, I padded down the concrete stairs, my head pounding, my mouth desert dry. I banged on door 11. Hearing only a muffled voice coming from inside, I knocked harder. "Just a minute," yelled Joe, "just a minute." Joe was the gaffer. We had gotten high together some hours earlier. I heard a toilet flush. I waited. The toilet flushed again. I pounded even harder. The toilet flushed a third time. Joe opened the door, fully dressed and prepared for a bust. "I need a towel," I said. The problem with being a drunk, and this is something I could not possibly have guessed at the time, is that even when you stop drinking, the fact that you were a drunk will forever intrude not only on others' assessment of you, but your own. It is impossible to write about that time in 1976 when I helped film a movie on Flannery O'Connor's farm in Milledgeville, Georgia, without first acknowledging that I was too much of a drunk to have read anything she had written, including the short story we were filming. For a key grip, this would normally be an unnecessary confession. Grip work is technical and has nothing to do with storyline or meaning. But I was at the time a 35-year-old man with a dream of being a writer. To be sure, years of drunken procrastination had transformed that dream into a kind of ongoing, ever more weather-beaten expectation. Lacking any evidence that I actually was a writer, and having failed enough at it to suggest that I wasn't, I had retreated to the high ground. I simply assumed I already was a writer. After all, if I could observe what I observed in life in such a brilliant way, wasn't my success a foregone conclusion? Drinking fueled this assumption, revved it up nicely each night, then drove it straight into a tree. Every morning as I kneeled at the toilet to puke up green bile, I knew I had gone another day without writing. I had taken notes, perhaps, while sitting at the bar, shameless observations of humans at the trough, scribbles whose chief purpose had been to make me appear intelligent while I sucked down bourbon and chased it with beer. But while a few fortunate synaptic collisions might have produced an idea or two, those ideas, either unreadable in daylight or incomprehensible to the sober mind, were destined for the trash. So this is what I brought to the experience of standing on a great American writer's home soil, a perverse and energetic dimness. Not that O'Connor herself noticed. Having been faithful to her art until the very end, she had succumbed to lupus 12 years earlier at age 39. But had she lived, she may very well have found my presence fitting, since dimness and the way it forestalls redemption were O'Connor's trademark themes. We were filming The Displaced Person, a story set in the rural South after World War II. Provincial ignorance, pettiness, and greed rule the lives of the central characters. A widow, Mrs. McIntyre, played by Irene Worth, hires an immigrant Polish farm laborer with an eye to replacing her dairy foreman, Mr. Shortley, played by Lane Smith. Seeing how eagerly the Pole works, she imagines hiring more foreigners to replace her two lazy Negroes, Astor, Robert Earl Jones, and Sulk, Samuel L. Jackson. Shortley and his wife, played by Shirley Stoller, conspire to get rid of the Pole. No one wins. Mrs. Shortley dies suddenly. The Pole is not so accidentally run over and killed by his own tractor. Mrs. McIntyre herself suffers a paralyzing stroke. Mr. Shortley and the Negroes move away. A priest, Father Flynn, played by John Houseman, whose advice Mrs. McIntyre has sought throughout the story, gets the last word. But Flynn is a cold and heartless man. He has no solutions, only the doctrines of the church. Which was a damn sight more than I had as I stumbled out of the crew van that hot June morning. I had missed breakfast, so I went straight to the snack table, which stood in the shade of the oak tree behind the O'Connor farmhouse. It was only 7 o'clock, but slivers of intense sunlight already shot across the lawn, announcing another scorcher. I poured myself a black coffee and eavesdropped while the producer discussed the day's schedule with the assistant director, Terry Donnelly. Having been racked by dry heaves half an hour earlier, I sipped my coffee carefully. Afraid to open my mouth too wide, I forced half a jelly donut past my teeth, sucked it back to my esophagus, then swallowed it in several gulps, the way a python ingests a rat. I wiped the sugar from my lips and fed the rest of the donut to one of the famous O'Connor peacocks that roamed the lawn. The day before, this same peacock had refused to show his startling tail to our cameras until I stood before him in my red and white striped Greek soccer shirt and strutted about like a peacock myself. He and I were buddies now. "Ready, Dusty?" asked Donnelly. "Standing by," I said. I wanted to die. I would have given a week's salary to drop dead right there on the grass. "Let's get to it then." "You got it," I said, waiting for Donnelly to lead the way. By the time I'd managed to maneuver the camera dolly into the tight quarters of the makeshift bedroom set, Lane Smith and Shirley Stoller were already in bed running their lines. The two of them made a very convincing white trash couple, Lane with his dark, beady eyes and greasy undershirt, Shirley with, well, I'll get to that. The non-insulated outbuilding that served as our set felt like an oven. We had blacked out the windows. A small fan turned meekly in the doorway, managing only to tease those of us who were squeezed into the narrow space on the opposite side of the bed. I could barely breathe. Shirley's character, Mrs. Shortley, was trying to make sense of the threat the Pole presented to her way of life. Intuiting that even the Negroes might be replaced by a wave of European immigrants, she was articulating a newfound altruism to her half-asleep husband. "Chancey," she said, "turn this away. I hate to see niggers mistreated and run out. I have a heap of pity for niggers and poor folks. Ain't I always been a friend to niggers and poor folks?" Shirley's southern accent seemed less than convincing, but she conveyed without effort the deep-seated treachery required of her character. There was about Shirley a natural aura of resentment, either caused by her constant physical discomfort or the cause of it. You couldn't tell which. Malice exuded from her pores on rivulets of sweat that the makeup woman daubed with tissues. The flesh on her arms was bubbly. The excess fat swallowed the elbow joints entirely. At her pinched wrists, the skin had bruised to the color of storm clouds. Multiple chins overwhelmed her neck in waves, finally coming to rest on her chest. A mottled heat rash painted her cheeks. Her breasts rose and fell beneath her damp cotton shift as she panted in the stifling air. This was not just an overweight woman, but an actress who seemed to have coaxed her obesity from stone, invented it, nurtured it, honored it. In a previous film, she had won accolades for playing a brutal Nazi prison camp commandant. Now, as Shirley lay sprawled on the dingy sheets waiting for Donnelly to quiet the set, her head rolled slowly and quite deliberately in my direction. Her gaze lingered on my crotch as she gave me the once-over from sandals to headband. Her eyes narrowed, then smiling as pitilessly as she might have smiled at a mosquito, she locked her eyes on mine and winked. The great thing about being a drunk is that you get to erase causal relationships. One event needn't be logically connected to the next. This allows you to muck about in the psychic depths and dredge up buckets of unambiguous, if inexplicable, terror. Heavy use of alcohol, nicotine, and cocaine exposes a person to raw experience without the filters of reason and common sense. Several days before Shirley winked at me, I woke abruptly from a hangover-induced Sunday nap, having dreamt that a lightning bolt struck the gold dome of a capitol somewhere. I had been unable to make sense of the dream, but in the immediate aftermath of Shirley's wink, I felt a residual electrical jolt. A normal man, one who allowed oxygen to aerate his blood, would probably have dealt with the wink with ease. In that gesture, he might have sensed the kindness that actually did reside in Shirley's heart and responded naturally, maybe even winked back flirtatiously, thus diffusing the situation. Not in any case taking it personally or feeling a threat. But I, in my dehydrated state, saw that wink as an unintelligible lightning bolt, a streak out of the unknown that suggested something I wasn't ready to consider. If Shirley so unabashedly desired me, then part of me must deserve that desire, match it, so to speak. But had I ever given this real-life woman any indication that I was interested in getting it on? Had I not made it clear every night in the local bar that the Georgia peaches who followed the crew around were more my style and my just desserts? Had I not shown patience in my pursuit of these honeys, even though they showed far less interest in my scribbles than New York City girls did? Did my past conquests not shield me from assaults like this? Apparently not. Like a man whose eyelids had been removed by torturers, I was compelled to stare at Shirley while she sized me up, all 150 pounds of me. I returned her come on with a stony stare, disowning her wink utterly. But a film set is an unforgiving environment. People within it are aligned like iron filings in a magnetic field. When Shirley winked at me, she did so in a way that announced to everyone present not just her desire for me or her expectation of fulfillment, but a kind of done dealness, suggesting that her desire for me had already been satisfied. Donnelly did not ask for quiet on the set. He didn't have to. The eyes of my peers were upon me. Suddenly forced to try to recall where I had been and what I had done the previous night before finding myself on the balcony, I blushed with all the fury of a schoolgirl. "She wants you," whispered Lane. "She told me so this morning. She wants you bad." "That's not even funny," I whispered back. But secretly, I was elated to hear that nothing had transpired between Shirley and me, that I hadn't led her on, or worse, the night before, that it was all in her mind. "She's your wife, Mr. Shortley," I told the actor. "You're the one who stuck with her. That's why you get the big bucks." "Ha," he said. We were in the dairy barn after lunch, preparing to film a scene in which Mr. Shortley asserts that he will not be intimidated by Father Flynn's plan to import more Polish workers. The sound man, Nigel Noble, asked Lane to read a line so he could get a decibel level. Lane cleared his throat and did so. Right, thank you, said Nigel in his English accent. He took a nip from a fifth of Jack Daniels he kept hidden on the sound cart, then offered me a hit. I took a gulp. Hey, Lane, I said, read that line again. Lane gave it his best drawl. Ain't no Pope of Rome gonna tell me how to run no dairy. We all laughed. The anxiety I had suffered since the bedroom scene was gone now. My gut felt warm. Beginning to feel the second wind, I found myself looking forward to the bar. The prop man, Chris Kelly, led a Guernsey cow into the barn, struggling to get it in front of the camera. Having worked on a farm when I was a kid, I slapped the cow's rump, shoved it forward into the stanchion, secured the clasp, and returned to my own work. As I bent down to unlock the wheels of the camera dolly, someone slapped my rump hard. I spun around, ready to clock whoever it was, and saw Shirley standing there, along with a makeup woman and producer, her fat hand held out to me. Reluctantly, I grasped her fingers and steadied her as she stepped across the dolly track. Thanking me, she curtsied and winked again. I turned to Nigel. Already he was passing me the bottle. Icy blue is the way Flannery O'Connor described Mrs. Shortley's eyes. Had I read her story at the time, I would have known that she had been tactful in her description of Mrs. Shortley's challenged body, and that she had, in fact, created an immensely sensitive portrait of a woman whose relationship to the unconscious was not unlike my own, dim yet charged with receptivity. Mrs. Shortley had lightning-like visions, so did I. She maintained a constant proximity to death and a precarious relationship to the truth, so did I. She was crude, but no cruder than me, and she went about assuming that she was somebody she wasn't, so did I. The differences between us were just as striking. I was not a fictional character in a story, nor was I going to be allowed, as it turned out, to exit this life at a young age. And unlike Mrs. Shortley, I couldn't blame my shortcomings on my natal circumstances or on the region of America in which I was raised. I had a prep school and college education. I had been brought up by well-meaning artistic parents in an environment of unquestioned privilege in the Northeast. Whereas Mrs. Shortley wished to constantly rid herself of the social disgrace she perceived to be her lot, I was working like mad to achieve that disgrace. What bridged the gap between our similarities and differences was the written and unwritten word. Flannery O'Connor had portrayed the dim-witted, uncomfortable in her own skin Mrs. Shortley, not because she shared her bigoted sentiments, but because those sentiments, when exposed, shed light on the deeper truth that we are all in this together, that to love, to have it, or give it, requires first an acknowledgement of shared humanity. O'Connor, knowing herself and knowing her time was limited, shared her own humanity by writing about these things. I, in portraying to those around me the dim-witted, uncomfortable in his own skin version of myself, was hardly that generous and brave. It would be years before I would quit drinking and begin to write. But I was in my own way chasing after and held steady by some deep need to share my lot in life with others. Beneath my drunken perversity ran a persistent and steady current. The knowledge that sooner or later I would have to account for myself, and that if all the pain I was going through were ever to prove worthwhile, I would have to put that account in writing. Already I was beginning to suspect that no amount of camaraderie at the bar was going to bring me closer to a shared humanity. When Flannery O'Connor's mother, Regina Klein O'Connor, offered me iced tea on her front porch that afternoon, I nearly turned her down. The day before, she had ordered all the men on the crew to put their shirts on while working anywhere near the house. Despite the sweltering heat, her dictum had caused widespread resentment and being quite quick to take up her dictum had caused widespread resentment and being quick to take up futile causes, I had voiced my Her dictum had caused widespread resentment, and being quick to take up futile causes, I had voiced my distaste for such manipulative and arbitrary Southern decorum. But iced tea was iced tea, and I needed badly to sit on a rocker in the shade. I accepted the perspiring glass, doily and all, and looked through the screen at the view to the west. A gentle breeze carried the odor of rattlesnakes nesting in the nearby field. John Houseman, dressed as Father Flynn, and Irene Worth, made up as Mrs. McIntyre, sipped their tea on a white wicker couch nearby. I remember that moment vividly, perhaps because it played out in silence, since I didn't know enough to recognize this privilege, this opportunity. I didn't ask, Mrs. O'Connor, did Flannery sit on this rocker in the days before she died? Was it hard on her to be so deathly ill and still feel compelled to write? Did writing help to shield her from a fear of death? And I didn't declare, your daughter is my mother's favorite writer. Or, when I was still a boy, Flannery was up north and writing stories a few miles from where my family lived. We swam in the same lake. I didn't last in the bar that night. It seemed I was invisible to the southern belles, and I just didn't have the energy to get my tail all afluff. I ate steak and drank 4 or 5 fingers of bourbon from a beer mug filled with ice, then caught a ride back to the motel with Lane and his driver. Feeling proud of myself for having pulled the plug before midnight, I took a long shower, arranged my clothes for the morning, then lay down on the bed and turned out the light. Lying there in the dark, I remembered how the day had begun. I forced myself to get up and unlock the motel room door just in case I found myself out there in front of the populace again. Lying back down, naked atop the fresh sheets, I fell asleep in the cool of the air-conditioned room. I am not sure exactly what woke me an hour later, but it was probably the sound of a raspy breath not my own, or the strange weight drawing me into the center of the bed. I opened my eyes. There lay Shirley, mountainous beside me, her hand reaching out to stroke my face. I'll read a very brief piece, and just for a change of pace for those who are interested, this is written in second person, which takes the place of the first person. It's like addressing oneself, really. Same theme, different time, decade earlier. It's called When You Finish Your Beer. You're 27 years old and you don't have a clue yet, do you? No idea what you're really seeing across the street. Just a tall black man standing alone and motionless in the center of the sidewalk, wearing a red bandana. You're sitting sideways in an open window 5 floors up, sipping Miller beer from a frosted mug. The evening ushers in a welcome breeze. Your wife is reading to your daughter in another room, Petunia, the goose. Sounds drift up from the block, bongo drums, the clack of dominoes on a tabletop, staccato chatter followed by hoarse laughter. From a transistor radio, you can hear staticky bursts of news in Spanish, something or other about the progress of the war in Vietnam and President Johnson's latest assessment. A reference to Martin Luther King Jr. You light a Marlboro, the last in the pack you opened this morning. You chase the hot smoke with beer, lean out, and spit. The man with the red bandana hasn't moved an inch. He's staring at a crack in the sidewalk, puzzled by what he sees. You like this perch. It provides you with a godlike omniscience. You like to think you've developed the eyes of a hawk, but you keep an old pair of binoculars on a nearby hook just in case. A week ago, you saw a man shot down there, a middle-aged guy dressed in a khaki trench coat and lugging a tan briefcase home from work, making his way toward Riverside Drive. He took a bullet right between the eyes, fell face first, hit the pavement like a parade ground soldier. You never heard the shot, not even a pop, you told the detective later. But you saw the man's hand fly open and the briefcase drop. An hour later, they found the kid who did it. He was sitting on his mother's bed, engrossed in a comic book, a .22 caliber rifle on his lap. 85th Street is littered with subject matter. Take Ronaldo, for instance, the pimp who lives across the street a few buildings west. Lean out a little farther and you can see him, hair all slicked up like Little Richard's, sitting just inside the first floor window, looking out from the darkness of his room. One elbow rests on a purple cushion he keeps on his windowsill. He's staring at his new cream-colored Caddy with its 2 circular side windows and its sky blue dashboard rug. Soon he'll be out and about in a white suit and a broad-brimmed chartreuse hat, everyone around him cowed by his flamboyance. The rumor is that he has 3 whores. What's up with Bandana Man? He's bracing himself for big things now, totally zoned out on heroin, still staring in disbelief at the crack in the sidewalk, a chasm. He's tilting back a little on his heels, and his hands are raised as if he's about to make a passionate declaration of despair. What is his problem? You put down your beer, take the binoculars off the hook, and focus them on the pavement in front of him. There's the problem, wedged in the crack, a bright wooden matchstick, its self-strike phosphorus tip still intact. You pan the glasses to the right, bony knees slightly bent, the right one poking through a rip in the man's pitiful jeans. Scuffed black shoes, the left without a lace. No socks, fly wide open. What a wreck. You'll jot down those details when you finish your beer, you tell yourself. You're going to fail, aren't you? That's still to come. Put the binoculars back on the hook. Don't let your beer get warm. No way you can know it yet, but for all your bright ambition, you'll wind up 4 years from now renting a little 2-room dump at the other end of this block without your wife and kid. No way to predict how many seasons, how many years in a row you'll stumble home from the bar after work beneath this very window. Do you already sense the attraction, the raw magnetism of the dissipated life? Do you really want to knuckle down and write? What do you imagine for yourself as a consequence? Success? Be honest. Is it love? There's this quart of beer to finish up right here next to you on the sill, and a spare bottle in the fridge for later. Be careful not to drop the mug out the window. Wouldn't want to distract Bandana Man. Look how he's got his left foot lifted 6 inches off the ground, like a stork in shallow water looking for a fish. His hands, waist high, move slowly sideways for balance. Fingers stretched like a hurdler's to the limit, just about to take that giant step. You still don't get it, do you? There's you up here, and then there's him down there. Oh, you'll manage aphorisms on napkins at the bar, and the rumor of your opus will precede you into every room. The empty page, your unstruck match. Thanks. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Actually, could you talk a little bit about how you wrote that second essay when you finished your beer, how it started?
Yeah, I was actually picking up an MFA at Columbia University, and at the age of 61, I think, something like that. So I was sitting with a group of people around a table, 12 to 15 of us around a long workshop table, with people probably half my age, basically. And it was one of those days when I just had enough, and I looked around, and the line just occurred to me. You're 27 years old and you don't have a clue yet, do you? And I've sort of just, it was my way of getting my antsiness out. And I said, that's really a nice line. I thought of this line and I wrote it down. And I went home immediately to write an essay beginning with this. You're 27 years old and you don't have a clue yet, do you? And I realized right after I'd written it down that I was talking about myself, not about the people in the room. Second person is good for that sometimes too. So it's a good self-berating kind of a voice. It's like a direct address, but it's turned this way. So. It's hard to sustain for a long period of time, though. I think some people do it, but.
I mean, you sort of half anticipated the question that was coming to my mind. This character of you as 27 seems remote from who you are now. You seem to have very little sympathy for this guy. Is that why you chose the second person in part? And could you be more sympathetic to that person? Is, I guess, what I'm driving at.
Yeah, I think I could be after writing that, though. I had to write it to get into that mode. That's what basically this book is about. It's fairly self-critical throughout, and it hammers at that. But looking back on it now, I think having written it, I can look with some sympathy on that, at that character. So,
Because, in the introduction, we hear about all the things you've done. I mean,
Right.
you describe yourself in that essay as someone who's led a dissipated life, or that to that point, led a dissipated life. But, I mean,
But then the introduction is fallen.
Well, I'd actually done a lot of those things up at that point too. So, but it was just in a sense, I think I saw what was coming down the road that, over that period of time, and because of the time it was, we're all living in our own time, and things have changed a lot in regard to that. But in that period of time, I was falling quickly into those kinds of ways, put it that way. They were popular. They were popular, and they were dicey, and they were experimental, and marriages were fragile, relationships were changing, in the 60s and 70s. All of which I think really happened as a result right after Kennedy's assassination, John Kennedy's. I think that put a kind of a point. So, 45 years ago.
I have a question. Did you find that working on movie sets hurt your creativity at all? Like working 20-hour days and being so close to creativity, but being the behind-the-scenes person?
I think it's very frustrating to because the work a key grip does is technical. It's non-creative in that sense. But working even in a creative way on a movie set is it's almost desperate, the number of people that you're involved with. I get into that in other chapters here that are too lengthy to read at a reading. But there's a lot of intensity, 100 people on a set at a time, and you just get drained, especially as a writer. It drains you as a writer. So as much as I kept in mind the idea of writing, it was very difficult to go home after that and write. It's also addictive, being around that many people. It takes the place of creativity. It really does. And that happens a lot. We're all familiar with that with the way we use cell phones. I find myself using email the same way. I'll be in the middle of writing something creative, and all of a sudden, because I can, I will switch to who's just emailed me. And that's dangerous. Because what it produces is a kind of false feeling that because you're in touch with somebody, you're not alone, which is wrong. I mean, you are alone, and creativity requires being alone, or writing requires being alone. And so the two are not really compatible.
Can you tell us about parachuting a little bit? I was really interested in that part of your biography. You taught parachuting? Is that what it was, or did?
Right, well, we actually started the first jump center in the United States in 1959 in Orange, Massachusetts. It's a place actually that is still going, not with the same people, but with the person who runs it now is a now older man, and he was the son of the wife of one of the people who started the place with me. So I was one of 4 or 5 people who started that jump center. And in those days, we didn't really know anything about free fall to speak of. The chutes were archaic, and the idea of getting a bunch of people together to come and jump for fun was a bit of a stretch. But I described that in one of the chapters here, a complete description of how I got into that as a young, basically a college dropout. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was bored with college, and it was just, I found it uninteresting. And I came home, much to my father's chagrin, in the middle of a semester and told him that I was now an existentialist, and I couldn't bear to be in college anymore because those, and fortunately, I ran into this wonderful kind of beginning of something that now is quite common and people do it all the time, and we pioneered a lot of the early techniques for people getting together in free fall, group jumps and competitions and all of that sort of thing.
And what year was that?
That was 1959.
Wow.
Then we opened up 2 more centers right after that. And in those days, we taught people to go out alone, on the first jumps, the first static line jumps. The chute was opened automatically with a static line attached to the aircraft. It took 4 seconds for the chute to open, and you'd fall away from the plane. But what I stress in this, without saying it overtly, is that experience of being alone, jumping alone, is very important to the idea, I think, of jumping. You do it yourself. You have somebody at the door with you, but no one's pushing you and no one's attached to you. It's not about being filmed doing it. It's about making that step yourself and going out and then experiencing that wonderful aloneness of just hanging there beneath a parachute on your own, then left to maneuver your own way down. Then you work your way up in free falls to the higher altitudes, from which they now teach first-time jumpers, because they hook them on. And I can understand why that's done. It's like a thrill ride, but it's a very different experience. A very different energy to it. The free fall is a wonderful thing. If you have, I recommend it. This book would have been better titled Free Fall, actually.
But did you know throughout, like, you're writing about when you're 27 years old and you're writing a decade later, did you know all that time what you wanted to do was write? Or is that something that came after these experiences?
I actually did know it all the time. I always had it in mind to do that.
And do you think that maybe you let yourself have a really adventurous life because you knew that the more that you experienced, the more you would have to...
Yeah, and I had an early sense that was the case. I went off hitchhiking very early and across the country and doing things like that. But that was in the air in the 50s. Kerouac was big, all the Beat generation. And so that's what you did. I mean, having experiences was something that's like notches on a gun. And the more you got, like the more states you could accumulate on your resume that you'd actually been in. And it wasn't so easy to get to one state and the next. I mean, flying was sort of out of the question. And, I mean, you could do it, but it would be a different kind of a thing. And there were no interstate routes for most of that period of time. And so it was a very unique experience. It was kind of going like that. I have students who ask me all the time, how can we mimic or do what you have done in our world today? And I find myself sympathizing with the problems of young people doing exactly the same things, of just taking off without knowing where you're going to go, risking things, and also being willing to blow off the idea of college until you've had some experience that teaches you what it is you want to get from college, things like that. And it's much harder now. It's in terms of people's expectations, but in a way it's not. And I think maybe that's coming around again. Maybe some hard times will lower people's expectations of making making a lot of money as being the most primary thing in life. There are other things in life that are interesting. One is experience, and then, of course, after having the experience, at some point, making sense of the experience.
Well, nobody's cut off now either. Everybody's got a cell phone, so.
Right. Which is a problem in a way. I mean, it's a great thing. I carry a cell phone, but for young people, it's hard also because they go to college and they're still, a lot of times, between classes, calling home.
Right.
And so there isn't that experience, again, of being off the umbilical in that sense.
I still don't have one. She's trying to get me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. I mean, it's a good resistance to do.
Everybody calls her phone looking for me.
Yeah,
but
that's
that's
the
the problem.
It's not the statement that I mind, it's being the metaphysical secretary.
No, I understand that completely. I mean, it is that kind of world, right? So, I encourage my students, for instance, in some of the writing exercises, to go to some place alone, watch a sunset, and experience it. And for a lot of people, it's the first time they've done that. I also encourage them to go not only alone, but without the cell phone, or without the the BlackBerry or whatever it is in the Access. It's not that far to go to do. It's simple, you're not going to be gone that long. It's not going to be that much of a big deal. But it's amazing how many people find it difficult to do that. And if you if you compare that with, which means that there's no room in our lives for imagination either, in the real sense. Imagination that's provoked by that kind of gnawing fear that's an awareness, even at a young age, that life is about non-life too. It's about the scary things. It's about dying. It's about everything else, and that the meaning of life comes from those darker things that we keep putting at bay, with all our technology. And failure, exactly. Failure is huge. Kim and I have a friend who's just won the Pulitzer for a collection of poetry called Failure, which I think is wonderful that he won the Pulitzer for that. I wish I'd thought of that. I could do that. But that's what it's about. You don't learn anything from success, and yet that's the one thing we're all taught is what we want. We want to follow that carrot of success. But actually, it's the not knowing what you want to do that produces what you're going to do. Not what you can't wish something into happening. Desire comes from a different place in the chakras. It's not always from up here. Okay, I know what I want. Well, some people do. I think some people are born with it, but they probably had that sense all their lives. From a young age, say a musician or something like that. But I think most of us don't know. And that's what, you take the risk and find out what it is.
Can I get shallow and sensational and ask for a celebrity story from your 25 years in Hollywood?
A celebrity story? There are a couple in here. You have to read the book. Yeah. It's actually not Hollywood. It's the film business, but it's not Hollywood itself. But I worked out of New York, which a lot of films are made out of that. It's a whole separate, it's like a separate industry in a way, although a lot of films come out of Hollywood. But a story, God. You have to read the book.
That's fair.
It would be mimicking the book itself. There are lots of stories.
You said before that you feel that Kennedy dying was like the turning point.
Yeah, I knew it the minute it happened. The way we all knew 9/11
Yeah.
was a turning point.
I wanted to ask you, just because I love history. Yeah, I hate when people say the 60s, like the 60s was like one feeling all the way through or anything like that.
Yeah, it wasn't.
Not that I lived or anything, but just looking back. What other, this has nothing to do with writing anything, but just your personal experience, but what other points in your life, looking at world history or American history, do you find are turning points in decades and things like that?
Well, in the 60s as well, John Kennedy's assassination, which basically reversed all my expectations as a college. I was by then going to Columbia. I was back in college, and I'd gone back to college because Kennedy was becoming president. A lot the way I see a lot of people inspired to do things because Obama has now become back. Because there was something in the air that said, okay, now I'm back in the game of all of us doing this together instead of just my individual quest of, the Kerouacian kind of thing. And that was just blown out of the water. Everything changed with that assassination. Not to put so much on Kennedy's head or to make him a hero, but that the expectations were high then for some kind of renaissance of thinking. And it was just taken away with a single bullet, basically, and things then deteriorated quickly. They deteriorated even more quickly in that same decade with the assassinations of the King and Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, for whom I had been working. So that also had a profound effect on me. And I think for a lot of people changed any tendency any of us might have had to get into politics ourselves. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was futile. And that feeling persisted until just recently, I think. Yeah. And if things had gone differently, it would persist now. I mean, it's been a long, hard slog of 2 generations long. I mean, students that I teach as incoming first-year students are now are, they have no memory of anything else other than an unresponsive, negative kind of power structure. You can say it doesn't matter, you can go live your own life and none of this matters, which we all have tried to do over the years, ignoring it, but it does matter. Things are being done in our name, and our identity, a lot of it is caught up, especially with television and media, is caught up with who we are as a nation as well. To pretend that it doesn't matter is a problem, I think.
What was your work like for Kennedy? Or is that also in the book?
Some of that's in the book too, but I haven't. I was an advance man for Bobby Kennedy, and in the mainly in the 1964 senatorial campaign. So because his brother had just been shot, and because that was a big deal at the time, it was like traveling around with the Beatles. I mean, it was national press, and it wasn't like a normal Senate run. It was sort of a big thing. It was very exciting, and taught me a lot about a lot of different things. But it was interesting to watch him develop at that stage, sort of make roads toward running for president 4 years later. And he went through a lot of changes. But basically, an advance man sets up the visits and takes the candidate through those visits, introduces him to people, makes him, make sure that he has the right names for people when he gives his speeches and different things like that. And it's a leapfrogging thing. One advance man will go from here to there to there. And, it was a job I wasn't at all prepared to do. But like everything else that I've done, I fell into it in a sense. It was like I had taught a fellow named Sam Beall how to jump out of airplanes. Well, Sam Beall happened to be the head of the government department at Harvard. And so when I tried to get a job with Kennedy the first time, they turned me down because I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't have any political experience. And so I just called Sam up and said, can you change this at all? And next day I got a call from the campaign saying, yes, of course you can work for us. And they made me an advance man, assuming that if Sam Beall thought I was good at it, I would know what to do. And I got on the scene, and this guy was being mobbed. My first job was to advance him into Harlem in New York City. And he came across the bridge, and I could not believe it. The crowds there were just enormous. He was the last candidate you could bring into Harlem or into any black neighborhood and get that kind of reception.
Tell them about the shirts.
Oh, that's when I first learned what it was like to be his kind of candidate as a star. We would ride, of course, in motorcades with open cars, no Secret Service. We had one bodyguard with a little pistol in his belt and one in his boot. And Kennedy was getting, he'd just have his shirts ripped off him. And basically, we'd have to change them 4 or 5 times a day. We ran over people in motorcades. People loved him, And blacks, African Americans loved him. They weren't called African Americans then. And, they sensed in him a kind of compassion, I think. So did Native Americans. Native Americans were very fond of him. He visited a number of reservations, including Pine Ridge, which is also in this book, my experience out there. And you still see pictures up on the walls of people who live on that reservation, of Kennedy talking to young children. And you can see by the look on his face and on their faces, here's the guy who's listening and has compassion for the people around him. It's not just visiting with an agenda. And, a little of the same feeling I get from Obama, or got, at a distance. I've never met him. Someone is vacuuming. That does it. Thank you very much.
The book is here for sale. If anybody wants to pick up a copy while Dustin's here, you can sign a copy, or it will be here in stock after the fact also. So Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for your questions.